Salamat Jarin, which is Syrian for blessings. Welcome to Galactic Federation Ships Part 2. Today, we are going to cover those ships of the Galactic Federation fleet that were formerly adversaries of the Federation. These will include ships of the Mintakan, the Altarian, the Rigelian, the Zeta Reticuli ships, or the Greys, and a few other ships that are part of what was once called the Anchara Alliance, the dark adversaries of the Galactic Federation during a long, long war that lasted millions upon millions of years. Today we're going to talk about the various aspects of our galaxy, which began in dark and is moving to light. So in order to fully understand the ships that we are going to be showing you today, we first have to start out with the origins of our galaxy and the nature of it back then. Back then, which is billions upon billions of years ago, when our galaxy was first formed, this is tens of billions of years ago actually, it was formed as a being that was both light and dark. It was decided by the Creator that this aspect of physicality would have a dark cast to it initially, and that this dark cast would be founded over by what is called Anchara. Anchara is simply, you might call it the dark force angel for this galaxy. It set forth various physical minions. These minions are called Anchara's children, and they created a vast, mighty force that billions of years ago was created. However, it was not fully physical until about 35 million years ago. Then they began a conquest of this galaxy. Now those ships that we're going to be referring to in the beginning are those ships of these beings. Now these beings are unique, that when Anchara created them, they did not possess a light body. They all had souls, they were sentient beings, but they did not have light bodies. That is, they did not possess the ability to translate their physical body into a spiritual body, a body of light. Once they died, their soul left their physical body, much as we do here in 3D, because we are also been dropped into limited consciousness, which they live in, a very high level of limited consciousness, but nonetheless one that allows them to have a lifespan and then death. Some of them live for centuries. But that doesn't matter. What matters for us now is to understand this light and dark aspects. Now, as we understand this, let's now look at our reality. Realities, as you will know from other videos that I've done, are based upon one thing, a collective series of agreements or precepts. And that these are divided into three parts, an outer grid or flux pattern, and then an inner structure with an inner grid. Now, let's look at realities as also having energies. They have frequencies. And you'll notice that in part 1, we talked about how ships can actually be there for a moment and then just seemingly disappear by just raising their frequencies up to the reality's flux, which is this outer level. But something else can be done by ships which is equally important, which I'd like to explain to you today. Ships Motion Explained Part 2. In this one, you see the flux wave on the outside of the ship, you see the flux of reality, and you see the direction of the wave propagation, which is how the ship operates. Now what we're going to talk about is another aspect of this, because as we stated, as you can see on the diagram, when the ship is in the flux of reality, it can instantly move to another location by setting the proper coordinates for a specific location. Now, it can do something else. If the ship puts out a beam and then raises the reality where that beam reaches up to the level of the ship, the radioactive capabilities or the resonance factor of that particular substance will change. So what does this mean for all of us? That means that if you're put in a beam of a ship, what happens is it raises up the level of your body to the frequency of the beam or of the ship, and then raises you into the ship. Hence, you're not really there. Or let's say you have a radioactive instrument, let's say a radioactive bomb, and the ship just raises its beam down, and what does it do? It moves the energies through at the same level, and as it does this, it then takes the radiation out. So what happens is ships can turn radiation on and off. This particular aspect is simply called by them the up and down quality of reality. In other words, reality operates on a collective resonance pattern. As it does this, it also has a pattern that can be raised up or dropped down by the ship. This happens when ships are there and over your head, or you're inside of them, or they put a beam down. This is also how teleportation happens, basically. They put a beam down, they raise the level of the frequency of every particle in your body, and then you just rise up, or you walk, or they can send you through walls, glass, or any other phenomena. So this is needed to be explained because it's necessary for you to understand two aspects of reality. One, this reality is originally set as a light-dark reality. Two, the basic collective energy or frequency of this reality can be changed by the addition of other energies. So when you understand those things, you can then look at all the different ships we have and understand how they operate better, because the ships of Anchara operate a little bit differently than the ships of the Federation that we showed you before in Part 1. Now, there are three basic aspects that are important for you to understand. One, these ships are more metallic. They are metal. They aren't living sentient beings. Secondly, and this is also important for you to understand, even though they operate under similar propulsion systems as the Federation ships that we showed you before, there are some differences. And this we will explain to you as we look at the different ships. Three, they're shaped differently. Each particular aspect of this galaxy has adopted different basic shapes for its ships. The Federation's a little more variety than you will see in the ships of the former Anchara Alliance. Something else for you to understand is the Treaty of Anchara ended the Galactic Wars. About 7 years ago, the treaty was signed between the Anchara Alliance and the Galactic Federation of Light. Under the Treaty of Anchara, which was signed roughly 7 years ago, all of the different ships we're showing you now are now members of the Federation. They are no longer part of the Anchara Alliance. And many agreements, etc., that we will refer to, and when we're talking about these ships, especially the Zeta Reticuli ship, we have to understand deep in our hearts that this is no longer where they're at, that they were part of a whole procedure, and that this procedure was part of helping the secret government of the society to take over, because they ultimately wanted to take over what the secret government was about. But that's all shifted. We have to understand we're going to many things that many of you who have been a part of the procedures that we're talking about were in fear about. We have to get over the fear, and we have to be in love with this. For our particular sector of the galaxy, the major controlling administration was what it was called the Orion Group, or the Orion Organization, or the Orion League. Now, the first ship we're going to see is a Mintakan ship. Now, Mintaka is one of the 3 stars that makes up the so-called Belt of Orion. The Orions, or the Orionites, however you want to call them, were the most important group in our sector for administrating the various empires that were part of the Anchara Alliance. So let's look at the Mintakan scout ship. The ship you will see here on the diagram, first of all, is roughly around 45 to 80 feet in diameter. The reason for the difference in its length deals with the various types of ships. These are what are called armed scout ships. Unlike most of the ships that you have seen before, their primary aspect was to be part of an invasion fleet or a fleet that was in charge of maintaining the empire. The closest idea of this probably would be for people to understand would be Star Wars. They're kind of like the evil empire. But As we look at this ship, understand that as the underpinning behind the design. Now, if you look at the design of the ship, you see it has the typical saucer shape. But what's below it is the most important part. So let's start with the top and look at it, and then we'll understand why the bottom. The top part of the ship held a crew. These crews varied in so many different sizes and so many different variations that it's really impossible to say what each one ship's crew was. It depended on the mission. These ships were mission-oriented. They would have anywhere from 3 to hundreds of people. So it can also depend on size, etc. The Mintakans are about 7 to 8 feet tall, very reptilian and amphibian-looking. Now, let's look at the ship on the bottom, because that's the most important part. The ship is basically the same in propulsion as the ones we showed in the first part. So what you had in the middle was your field generator, and then at the bottom you had your power system, and then your power system was then related to how to control the fields. Now, the difference can be seen immediately if you look at the first part. You see here it says array of 8 lights on weapon ring junction boxes. What happened was the propulsion system was basically divided into 2 parts. The first part was the power of the ship. The second part of the power generator of the ship was the power of the weapons. Now, 2 types of weapons are used. The first type of weapon is a pulse beam, a high energy pulse beam, kind of similar to a strobe light in its power, and it would put out a pulse of high energy. It's actually more powerful than electricity, and it's not really plasma. So you might call it a metaplasma, because it's not really either aspect. Now, how this would operate is, when they wish to use the pulse beam, you see those 8 lights of weapons there. Those would be started to be pulsed. So the different blue and red lights would start pulsing. At the same time, they would have to control the stability of the craft, since they was powering down as far as power to operate the ship. Therefore, the strobing lights at the edge of the foil would start strobing at a much higher rate in order to compensate by pulsing the field. When you did that, what would then happen is that the beams would then start building up. Now, the next part was the bottom part. And what happened with that is there would be various arrays. And these arrays would then move, and the pulsing of each beam would go through these particular arrays. So you look down before you and you'll see 2 to 4 foot sensor unit of array. So the arrays would then be aimed by the computer on the ship, and then where it had to be, it would then pulse. And therefore you can probably hear the beam would be just a big of energy. Now, the second beam that they would use was a beam that didn't pulse, but it had a higher power, and that was one that was like a plasma or a particle beam. And this would be created by increasing the pulsing on the 8 lights on the weapon rings all the way around. And then when the pulse reached a certain energy, the number of sensors where the beam had to be put would be directed, and then it would come out. Now, another important part of the ship is how it lands. And as you see here, it has a tripod landing system. The tripods were set up so that as they landed, they were weight sensitive, and so regardless of the terrain, it would always land so that it was totally stable. The sensors can also be used to be set into instruments that allow you to look at the different aspects of a planet. So they could send their sensors, and by increasing the energy to the sensors, they could actually increase the sensitivity of their instruments. So they could scan a planet all the way down to the planet's core. They could scan people, etc. So they could determine weaponry. the nature of how many people were there, etc. The Mintakan scout ship was initially established, as I said, for fleets to control populations or at the advance of wars. And so as a result, the Mintakan scout is the first example of the Alliance ships. And this is an important thing we have to understand about these ships. Their basic orientation is control and the maintenance of missions that are primarily militaristic. Their aspects were to look at a population, establish the nature of the population. That is, what level of technology did it have? What level of government did it have? What kinds of beliefs did it believe in? What was its basic cultural aspects? And then use that as possible for its mission. Or use it as a forerunner for fleets as they came in so they would know what was ahead of them. So that's the difference between these ships and the Federation ships that we've seen before, which were unarmed scouts, which were part of a whole process of the Federation's science and exploration to look at a new part of the galaxy or of galaxies surrounding us, and then once having looked at it, make decisions with the local hierarchy on what to do. Was it a time for a contact? Was it time to include them in the whole procedure of unfolding creation? Or were they yet having to evolve more, and all that was needed was maintaining a degree of guidance for them? So that's the difference. That's the difference between the two fleets initially. So let's look at the next ship. And you'll see how this continues, but this ship is a little more infamous. Now, as a result of what happened at the end of World War II, namely the atomic explosions, etc., and the interaction of advanced technologies that we had, mainly the Germans and also certain aspects of the United States and British governments, and Russian, the result was that various aspects of the Alliance, whose job was to look and observe, came. Now, the main group that did this for this sector of the Orionites were the people from Zeta Reticuli. They came with one basic purpose. That purpose was to explore. Now, this also is a ship that's primarily designed as an observation ship. Unlike the other armed ship, it mainly does not have weaponry. Zeta Reticuli scout ship. This ship is primarily a ship designed as a forward observation for a fleet. So depending on what they saw or what they came back with reports about, determined whether this area was to be left alone or this area was to be attacked, basically. So these scout ships were brought, and of course when they were knocked down between 1942 and 1949, it almost led to a war between this planet and the Inchara group from Orion. However, this group did make peace, and once again the Zeta scout ships were used for something else, and that was to basically look at Earth's population. So these ships initially were the basic ships used in the quote-unquote abductions that occurred between the 1950s and the 1990s. And what we have to once again look at with this is, remember, these ships are not to be looked upon with fear or with remembrances of what are happening or has happened, but what is now occurring. And because they are now part of the Galactic Federation itself, their mission has been changed from being a part of being dark overlords over this planet to being part of a vast fleet, bringing us a new reality, a new aspect which will lead us to being fully conscious beings. So let's now look at the ship as a ship now. It has the famous, which everyone knows about because they've heard about it, saucer shape, but with the slightly narrowed cabin on the bottom and this broader cabin on the top. and the top having the strobing lights, which a lot of people involved with abductions have seen. They remember the lights, the tremendous white light of the fields, etc. Now, the people who were in charge of controlling these, of course, were a hybrid dinosaur and reptilian human hybrid, which we know as the Greys. Their primary purpose with these ships was, of course, to survey Earth's population, both biologically, telepathically, and otherwise. So as you look at these ships, remember them not through fear. So when you see them, remember that they are not about fear anymore. They are about bringing us into a new reality. Now, these ships also, especially the Zeta Reticuli scout ship, are similar to the style models which the secret government has, and which they, of course, have had for decades. And what they have done with these ships is use them to maintain the fear. So, and these are also the kind of ships that you see when you look at Area 51 and you see the ships rising above it, or many other secret government places. Let me just say that the Zetas have come back recently, since the Treaty of Inchara was signed in '95, to make amends for what they did in the past few decades, so that they, who are the abductees, can understand that the Greys and or the Zetas, or which term you would like to use, are now part of the Federation, are part of love, and are attempting in the best way they know how to teach people about love and to get them out of their fear and their shock and their hatred of talking about this whole thing, so that they can now discuss it and understand the many lessons that it taught them and use it to help others understand what is now happening to everyone on this planet, which is unity and a coming together in love. Now, the next ship we're going to see is from another part of our galaxy.
An Eridani scout ship.
What we have to remember about these Eridani ships is that Eridanus, just as Orion, just as many of our constellations that you see, were part of a vast galactic war that went on for millions and millions and millions of years. So parts of Eridanus, or Eridani, if you want to call it that, meaning the beings. Eridanus is the name the astronomers use for it. Eridanus means the river. It's called the river because it looks like a snake winding just below the foot that contains Rigel, which is basically the left foot as you look up of Orion in the night skies. This particular ship, more than the Zeta Reticuli ship, is known to many because it's the ship that was primarily used initially in its most primitive forms by the U.S. government for its initial secret ops projects back in the 50s and 60s. So let's look at the Eridani scout ship. Now, as I said, this is primarily a ship done by a reptilian group. There are hundreds of stars in Eridanus. What we're talking about now are the reptilian empire that was part of this system. There's another series of people that we'll be talking about later when we talk about Galactic Federation members. That was Galactic Federation humans, but this group is not what we're referring to when we refer to the ship. Now the ship, once again, which is shown here in a light blue, is metallic. The exterior is very shiny. It looks almost like an aluminum if you were to see it in the daytime. That's because it's metallic. It's not a sentient type of metallic. As you remember, in part 1, we talked about ships actually being living beings, and their skin was this metallic-looking stuff, which was actually built out of light. These particular ships are similar to what we would construct. So they're like aircraft. They have a very incredible series of advanced, molecularly created alloys, which are part of the skin. They create the metal. Now, this skin as I said, doesn't have a life force in it like a Sirian ship would have, or a Pleiadian ship, or a Lyran ship from the Federation, or an Andromedan ship. It's different. The other thing that makes it different is the nature of how it operates. Its field is not like a soul of the ship. It's like a propulsion system. It's like an advanced jet aircraft, basically. Even though it has no relationship in how it operates to a jet, that's just an example. When you see one, a lot of the problems that a lot of people have with the initial fear of it was it doesn't have a feeling of life to it. It feels dead. So when you see it, the first thing that you notice as far as a feeling is dread. And that was part of how the Alliance operated. They wanted people to feel that dread. Secondly, they're big. This is one of the smallest ships in the fleet. It's about 45 feet across. Many of the ships of the Alliance are huge because they believed that the concept of fear was how you controlled people. So they believed totally in size. So their ships are enormous that are their scouts, whereas the average Pleiadian ship is about 30 to 45 feet. This is the smallest one. Most of their scouts of the same type would be 50 to 500 feet long. They believe in bigger. They also usually don't come by themselves. They tended to come in groups. This was the other thing. They believed numbers and size were the basic aspects of maintaining control. Because if you saw a lot of ships, it worked in a positive manner as far as fear goes. It would get you positively scared. That was what they believed. Because they were mostly dealing with limited conscious beings, much like ourselves are now. And they believed that high technology combined with force created a fear that equaled manipulation, that equaled control. That was basically their formula. So that's how these scout ships worked. Now, not all humans in this galaxy were Federation humans. There were many rebel groups, or there were whole groups that even went so far as to even be a part of the Inchara Alliance because they felt that they could control better being part of this alliance, which leads us to the next group. And this next group is the Altarians. Altarian scout ship. Now, Altar is less than 17 light years from Earth. They're the main star in what's called Aquila, which is the brightest star in the constellation of Aquila, the eagle. And this was very important. It's what's part of what's called the summer triangle to astronomers in the summer sky. The other two of which were Deneb, which is the brightest star in Cygnus, which is just below Andromeda, and Vega, which is the brightest star in Lyra. So they were right near the core heart of the Federation. Yet in spite of that, they believed in being neutral towards the dark than being neutral towards the light. So their ships were a combination of both Federation technology and Chara-like technology. And this can be seen if we look at their scout ships and spend some time looking at them and understanding the nature of their technology. Because this is a very important point that we have to understand about how things operated in the galaxy. How light and dark came together and created this reality. So, let's look at the Altarian scout ship. Once again, the thing about size. The ship's flight foil is 150 in its largest versions across. Now, the field is noted for its flame-shaped ring around it. Now, let's describe how this operates. These are the two different technologies that we've been talking about amalgamated together in a very unique way. The Altarians were experts at amalgamating things. So one of the most important things we have to understand about is how did they synthesize the ship. Now, we just said Galactic Federation ships are built out of a light based upon life, so that all these ships were basically organic. Now, how do you do this and yet make a ship that's metallic? So the Altarians did that. How did they do it? First, they built a ship out of metal. And if you look at the diagram, you see this. These ships are metallic, but they have these flame-shaped rings around them. What are these flame-shaped rings about? What they do is they put life into the metallic ship. When the ship is operating, it acts and it has a signature similar to a Federation ship. One of the first things you would notice if you had an instrument and you could really discern the difference between ships, in other words, a Federation ship and an Ancharian or Alliance ship, whatever you wanted to call them, you would see a difference. One just had a signature of a propulsion system. The other one had a propulsion system signature plus a life force. Now, if you just had a certain level like on this one, you probably wouldn't notice that. But if you really had, let's say, sophisticated instrumentation to sense and measure ships, you would see that. Now, the Altarians wanted to put both together. How did they do that? First, they took the propulsion system, and it draws in the light energies, just as all propulsion systems do. But what does it do? It also uses these rings. What do the rings do? The rings take this light in and put a field around it similar to the signature Federation ship. In other words, when the ship is powered up, it has a life essence. Now this life essence can then control the ship much as a Federation ship does. The way the organic computers on a Federation ship operate is that they have a technology tied into the soul of the ship. Alliance ships, or Ancharian ships, don't have that. They basically are tied into the soul energy of the operator. So that makes them a different kind of ship. They need the operator to work, or they don't work, they don't start. They're tied into the frequency of that particular being. Whereas Federation ship is tied into the life energy of the ship. So that's one basic aspect. So all ships in the Federation could start up and work and operate, but what did they need? They needed to feel the beings that were operating them. They needed to feel their loving, caring energies. If they didn't have that, they wouldn't work right. So that's how how their system was tied in. They're similar in that you need certain energies to operate, but one is different than the other. Now, many of the ships that operate that are Black Ops HAPs, since they were based upon similar technology to what the Ancharian or Alliance ships had, they have a similar thing. The pilot, or the operator, whatever you wish to call him or her, that being, let's just say, his or her energies determined how that ship operated. So the person had a so-called mind meld, so to speak, with the ship, to use that term. If they didn't, the ship wouldn't start, the ship wouldn't operate, because you then became the soul of that ship. Federation ship would operate initially, but it wouldn't work if it felt that the beings inside of it weren't of a love energies, because they were tied into an interaction between love of themselves and their crew and their mission. These three things were important. So that's how these two ships operated. Now, what did the Altarians needed to do? They needed to create a ship that created both, because they were humans and they wanted to feel the energies of the ship without having to melt in with the ship and actually have a pilot or a crew whose sole purpose was just to become one with the ship and work it. They wanted the ship to work on its own with just simple controls. Minimum worry about the whole process of how it went thither and thither, etc. Except during certain times it required a great degree of control. So then they used these rings and they created a ship that was both. So now the ship was alive when it operated. Hence, it was now like a Federation ship. It would operate and do things just as you wished, without having to have a crew whose sole purpose was to maintain 100% total dedication to maintaining the energies at a certain level so the ship could operate properly. They no longer needed to do that. So that's why the Altarians created these kinds of ships. Now, when many of the Federation people saw what the Altarians were doing, they looked at what they were doing with a great deal of disdain, but also love, because they understood that Altar and its people understood that at a certain time they would return it totally to the Federation, which they did 7 years ago. But until that time, they were kind of the rebels. They were the group that most was able to interface with, say, Earth, because Earth humans are important to how this planet operates. We basically are all humans, whether we're the minions of the group running the show, the guys at the top, or ourselves. We're all basically the same. So these people, the Altarians, were used as the interlopers. They were a basic control faction between the group in charge, which was the Anunnaki, and the minions of the Anunnaki, which were the secret governments that run our planet. So there were a lot of Altarian interaction. As a matter of fact, many, many people who talk about what happened between the secret governments and the aliens, quote unquote, or the ETs, or the EBEs, or whatever you call them, talk about these tall humans. These tall humans were the people from Altar. These were their ships. Now, the other thing that they did was they used something similar to what the Federation, which is noted for, which is a four-legged landing gear on the ship. They used, once again, an amalgam, because most of the ships that we are seeing are either triangular, have 3 landing gears, tripods, etc. 3 is a very important number in the Incharan Alliance. 4 and 7 and 11 and all that are important to the Federation, as anyone who knows about magical numbers, etc., understands. Now, let's go to the next step. Let's look at some of the defense ships that went along with this and use it to explain the transformation and changes going on. The most important thing for us to understand when we look at these defense ships is to understand their nature. Now, the first ship we're going to look at, as you can see here on the diagram, is the Syrian defense ship, which is a Federation ship. It's a Galactic Federation ship. This ship is used by Galactic Federation humans from the Sirius star system, as it says there. Basically from the Sirius B and C star system, because those are the 2 basic occupied systems in Sirius. Previously, we talked about 2 different types of ships. The first kind were the unarmed scouts of the Federation in Part 1. Then at the beginning of this particular tape, we have talked about the various types of Inchara Alliance or Dark Alliance ships, which are a part of their fleets. And we've showed you the differences. They tended to be mostly armed. If they weren't armed, as with the Zeta ships, they always had around them or near them aspects watching them to see what would happen. If there was enough problems, enough ships knocked down, then there would be some form of reaction, because the form of the Dark Alliance or the Inchara Alliance or the Incharans, however you want to call them, their basic aspect was if anything happened, there had to be punishment for it. It was very brutal, very severe. So this is a difference. The Syrian defense ships were part of an entire fleet of S&E exploration ships, which included huge motherships, which we're not talking about today. For those who don't know what an S&E is, let me explain it. It simply means science and exploration, which are the two basic missions of these fleets. One, to explore the galaxy. Two, to use their advanced technologies or science for first contact when necessary. Now, Syrian defense ships were always kept in abeyance, or any kind of defense ships. These types of triangular ships originally originated with another group, which is the Ancharan group, and we'll get into that second. But I wanted to do the Syrian ship first because it's a typical aspect of the defense ships used throughout the Federation. Now, if we look at it, for the most part, these ships are under 200 feet on a side. They contain a weapons and propulsion pod in the middle of the ship, and then 3 different lights, which are part of the whole navigation and field sensor system. Once again, refer in part 1, the previous tape, where we talked about the propulsion system. And in there we talked about the fact you needed a power system, you needed a central field core, you needed a field emitter, etc. Well, this particular thing on the bottom here is both the generator, the field controller, and the emitter, all built into one. The reason for that has to do with the nature of how its weapon system operates. So we're going to go and spend a little time here and explain this to you, and then I'm going to show you the Alliance ships, because it's important that you understand the differences, and we'll kind of go back and forth so that you'll have a better idea of this, because we've never really introduced defense ships before. But I think they're important because it'll give you once again a difference between the concepts that we just talked about and just how ships are put together. We talked about the Alliance ships being more inorganic and the Federation ships being more organic. Once again, this whole concept is shown even in the warships. And that's why I'm going to start with the Federation one, which is the Syrian defense ship, which you see here in the diagram. Now, let's go to the diagram. Let's get a closer look at it and give you a better idea of what that means. Now, we just described the center light. Now let's go down to the side view of the ship, and you'll see at the top there's a small dome. Now, the field emitters, unlike in the ship that you have seen before, are the diagrams that we showed you of before we used the Syrian unarmed scout. What we're going to show you now is an armed ship. Now, at the bottom of the side view is that little red bulb, which you see over on the left side, and then the dome on the top. Now, if you look at both, look at them as a propulsion system. And remember what that propulsion system is all about. When the energies are going up and down, as we explained how the system operates in part 1, what happens now is it can be redirected. So what happens is the beam goes up and down and increases every time at its bottom cycle. And then it's usually shot up, and that maintains how the whole process of how the propulsion system works operates. Now, here's the difference. Every time it comes down, if it's a weapon, it pulses outward. And unlike with the other ships that we described, you needed a special pulsing junction to create the beam. This comes directly out of the ship's propulsion system. So every time it shoots, it kind of drops a little. So to maintain it, what usually happens is these ships operate in series. So what happens is you take 3 or 4 or 6 or 8, and they come together and they put the beam at a certain direction. As the beam comes together, it creates a stronger beam. Then the propulsion systems are not messed up, and it creates the beam, and it goes at a greater distance and hits at a greater strength. So this is how Syrian defense ships tended to operate. They tended to operate in a series of 3s or 6s or 12s or 20s or whatever. This was part of their whole procedure. Now the difference then is in the Ancharan ships. So let's look at them right now, and we'll show you how they operate.
Anchara Alliance defense ship.
And once again, you see the difference in how the technology works and how it creates a different philosophy. Now, here's the Ancharan ship. As it says here, it was used by the former dark forces of the galaxy known as the Anchara Alliance. Now, same weapons pod, same red pod. Only this time, notice the difference. The top part of the ship has a huge dome, whereas you do not find that in the Federation ships. That's because their weapon system operates differently. How does it operate differently? Let's look. Now, it has a recessed pod. Why? Two reasons. First of all, the weapons pod is tied into the propulsion system indirectly. What is happening is it acts actually as a storage device. Different. As the storage device works, it builds up a greater and greater force. When this force reaches a certain level, the armament of the ship comes on. As it does this, it can then fire in any direction. What it can do is actually fire a 360-degree beam if it needs to, or a directional beam. Now that's the big difference between these two ships. One is designed primarily for defense when required. This device was designed as a marauder. It was designed as one ship, or many, could go in and each one would have a distinct target, or a distinct series of targets, or a large area of targets. So once again, difference in purpose. Defense only when necessary and as powerful as needed. This one, maximum terrorism, designed totally for one purpose: fear and control. So this is the difference, once again, in the philosophy of the two groups. One is based upon love, the other one upon fear, control. The result of all of this is a basic philosophy. Now, what happened? Anchara is the great dark force that was sent by heaven into this galaxy in order to implement the darkness of this galaxy. This being then brought forth many minions, or beings, on many star systems throughout this galaxy. These were heavily influenced by the sayings, the prophecies, etc. that Anchara from time to time gave them, so that a mindless and endless series of wars were fought for millions upon millions of years. Recently, Anchara, as part of a great prophecy, said there would come a time when all of these wars, all of these crazy, ridiculous destructions would come to an end. This was done in 1995 when Anchara instructed these beings to come forward, negotiate with the Galactic Federation, and end this great war. This was done, and because Anchara's great prophecy was the reason for it, it has therefore been called throughout the Federation as the Treaty of Anchara. Anchara, in turn, as we said, was following what the divine plan had said, because the purpose of this creation was to create a great darkness, put in a great light, and have the light and the dark come together and then create an even greater light. As a result of all of this peace spreading through the galaxy, a great transformation became part of the great energies of this galaxy. This in turn has affected all of us, because now our great change, our great shift, is affecting the entire galaxy. Because at the crux of the Treaty of Anchara was that it became permanent when this planet in its full unified form, both the surface people, which we are, and the inner earth people, which we vaguely know about and are part of our myths, namely Agartha or Shambhala, that all of this is now to be unified. And as we unify, so this will end permanently the great galactic wars. In 1995, Anchara delivered what is called, among the former alliance nations, the various empires, a great decree. This decree said, in early 1995, said that all of Anchara's children, all the various empires, all the various star nations, were to come together and make a great peace pact the Federation. This they have done. And over the last few years, first a massive group in 95 and early 96 came across. Then the last group, which totally thought that what Enchara had said was not true, was not the real Enchara. They fought it. They failed. And in 96 to 98, these groups gradually left their aspects and became one with the light. The most important of this was, of course, that as each group left, it joined the Federation. All the people that we have been talking about, the Zeta Reticuli people, the Altarian people, the peoples of Orion, the Malmatakan people, all the other groups, the Rigelians, etc., all of them have become part of a vast, unified Galactic Federation. This Federation is now unified. Now there is only light being brought into this planet, not darkness. There is only out there in the galaxy light, not darkness. This is one of the most important things we have to understand as we look at all of these ships that we've talked about in Part 1 and in Part 2. These various ships were once warriors against one another in one way or another, because Enchara had decided that there was a vast, endless struggle that had to be fought. This endless struggle has now ended. This vast fleet that we have described in these two parts has now come together into one. This incredible act of peace is a part of how we all have to look at this. We have to see this Federation as a unified oneness filled with light. Why, in the end, did all these different beings of darkness come together? They came together because of one thing. They were told by Enchara that the one thing that most of them lacked, which was a light body, they now would get as a result of what is happening. All these various beings are now seeking, just as we are, to become fully conscious beings of light, to have a fully integrated light body, to have a soul integrated with all its various aspects, to prove that even the darkest of the dark can become light. This is now what this galaxy is doing. It is bringing forth a great and glorious shift in who and what we are. And we, like all the other beings that we have been discussing, are in the same procedure. We are now in the midst of a great and magnificent shift into light, into becoming fully conscious aspects of light. So use your inner logic and your inner love to accept all that you see here and understand the oneness of it, and that it was just part of a great and magnificent play. All this drama has been done. And now the time has come for us to take this and bring us back into the oneness that we all are. As we move from one technology to another technology, our consciousness changes and shifts. And as we do this, we need to understand more and more who and what we are, and how this technology helps us to grow. And also that technology in and of itself does not change who and what we are. What it does, it amplifies it. We are now in a period where vast shifts are happening, where we are being amplified by our own energies, by our own shift. This amplification is why we are now changing. Similarly, all the shifts that we have seen here today are part of a vast change. Everything is shifting and coming together. It's integrating. Just as we on planet Earth are changing and shifting, so as you've seen, this entire galaxy is shifting and changing. What we have shown you today is only a small part of the thousands of ships and types that we could have shown you. What we are doing is just showing these to you for two reasons. First of all, Most importantly, the nature of their technology is advised to Federation technology and how these two technologies had a different base. Secondly, on both sides, to show you that these technologies have points where they can merge and shift, and that in their technologies was a basis for a great coming together. This is what we have shown you today. So view all that we have seen and shown you as part of this procedure, this evolution of who and what we are, and that this evolution is now happening at an accelerating level. Think of in the last 7 years how much we inside have changed on a planetary level and on an individualistic level. This is the key to who and what we are. We are the linchpin to creating a new reality. Until next time, we simply ask that you look upon this tape as being an example of the many different ships that are now of a unified Galactic Federation fleet that has come here to bring us love and a whole new reality. And what we would also ask of all of you, our great listeners, is that if you have clear videos or clear pictures of ships, and only one of the clear ones, not little dots or anything, but clear pictures, if you can send those to the address that we will give you, as well as instructions to be given to you on the website later, then we will be more than happy to use them in the making of a next video. So until we meet again on this tape, I say to you, Zazuma, which is Syrian for thank you, and Salamat Jah. Start again.